Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Divination Death Witch. I'm your host, Rin, and today we're going to discuss what a Death Witch is and what a Death Witch does. If any of you watch Sister Wives, which is one of my guilty pleasures, and you were wondering if the title of this episode is a reference to an iconic statement made in that show, yes, it is. I do want to say that a lot of people don't like or aren't comfortable talking about death or related topics, and we are going to be talking about those things a lot today. So if that's not something you have the spoons for at the moment, that is absolutely 100% perfectly okay. You can skip this episode if it's not your brand of poison right now. As a spiritual person and a death witch, I do feel that we as a society need to speak more openly about death. But I 100% understand that in each of our lives, there are times where it's not the best moment for us to tackle this topic. Your mental health matters, so I leave it up to your discretion if it is in your best interest to listen to this talk on this day. You know what is best for you. Maybe it's because I'm Gen X, but I've always sort of rebelled against labels. I mean, Gen X was and still is the don't label me generation. While labels do perform a vital function in society and our daily lives, I don't like to over-label things. I'm a minimalist, if you will, when it comes to labels. I began my official pagan practice back in the late 1990s, and from the beginning, finding a label that fit my practice was problematic to say the least. The best I could really do was to say I was an eclectic, with a focus on the Celtic pantheon back then. I tried a few other labels, but nothing really stuck. And for the most part, being Gen X after all, I didn't really need a label. I just did what I did. But whenever you interact with other witches and pagans or spiritual folk, you're going to be asked what type of witch you are, or to define your practice with a succinct label. And I always dreaded that question. There wasn't a good label for my practice. And for the most part, as I said, I was fine with that, other than when I had to try to explain to others what I practice, because there was no concise label or answer to satisfy their query. And I just want to say that as a witch, no, you do not have to have a label for your practice or what type of witch you are. You don't have to be any type of witch. You can simply be a witch. And that's basically how I have operated for most of my practice for 25 years. I don't know when the term death witch was actually coined. I have tried to look into it, and it doesn't seem like there is a good answer, and to be honest, I'm not sure when exactly I started to hear the term being tossed around the pagan community, but it does seem or feel very recent to me. Books, blogs, vlogs, etc. that use the term seem to be relatively recent, within the last couple of years. In fact, when I did a quick Google search on the old Google machine and on YouTube, the oldest video I could find on death witchcraft was from 2018. And when it comes to books, the oldest that I could find that uses the term death witch is from around 2020 or 2021. That doesn't mean that death work, death magic, or death witchcraft are new. But the term does appear to be newer, and you'll get different definitions of what a death witch is depending on who you ask, which, let's face it, in the pagan community, that's par for the course. There isn't one codified definition or set of practices, and maybe that's part of why it appeals to me. It's a label that still affords me the freedom to be me. The practices under this heading are both modern and ancient, again, probably part of why the label appeals to me. Well, appeals to me now, anyway, now that I know of this label. So what does a death witch's path look like? Or what is a death witch? Or, if you're a Sister Wives watcher, what does the death witch do? Again, not all death witches are the same. But some common themes you'll find among death witches are the following. Working with death, capital D. Some see death as an actual entity, but others, like myself, conceptualize and work with death, capital D, more as an energy or even an egregore rather than a naturally occurring spirit or a deity. Some death witches work with deities that are associated with death, dying, spirit communication, etc. Not all death witches are deists, but I do happen to be a deist death witch. Some include bones, etc. in their workings and their altars, honoring or working with the natural cycles of life, birth, growth, and death, gardening or raising animals or other activities where you nurture living organisms through the cycle of life and death. Death witches work on understanding death to help us live better and more fulfilling lives. Some incorporate death into our magic in one way or another, and there are many, many ways this can be done. Some of us engage in grave tending or cleaning. Some of us assist the spirits of the dead. Others enjoy working with poisonous plants. Now, not as in they poison people kind of way, but they work with these plants in their craft in a safe and respectful manner. Now, here's the super scary word, necromancy. This word has a very negative connotation in our society, and often when it's mentioned, we think of something along the lines of what we see in D&D, where a magic practitioner raises an army of the undead. But the actual definition, according to Oxford, is the supposed practice of communicating with the dead, especially in order to predict the future. For those who aren't language geeks, there are what we call the connotative and denotative definitions of a word. The denotative definition comes straight from the dictionary, and the connotative definition is more how it's used in society. Even though the denotative definition of the word necromancy isn't negative, at least to those of us who work with the dead, the connotative definition of the word necromancy, even within the pagan community, can still be viewed by some as dark or negative. If you don't like the word necromancy, that's okay. You can simply say that death witches often include some form of communicating with spirits and the dead, be that through divination or mediumship, into their practice. But to be honest, I'm the kind of person who kind of likes to lean into the creepy vibe of necromancy. Some death witches function as death doulas. The traditional form of a doula that many of us are familiar with is someone who functions kind of like a midwife, and they help in the birthing of babies. They are someone who helps a person transition into this world. A death doula is someone who helps a person and often helps the person's family as the person transitions into the afterlife. They may be drawn to palliative care or hospice care for people or animals. Any sort of healing work might be part of a death witch's practice also. Moon or nocturnal magic may be something that they partake of, and they may also do work with the underworld. Again, these are just some examples, since this isn't a clearly defined path. A death witch might practice any combination of the things on this list, or many other things as well. Someone could practice any number of the things that we discussed on this list and not consider themselves a death witch. As you can see, while the term death witch may be contemporary, the practices under this heading are a mix of new and old. While I may be just coming to a place where I label or define myself as a death witch, when I look at the practices of a death witch, turns out I've been one my whole life. I resonate with much on that list, and a great many of those practices are included in my spiritual path and have been for a very long time. Death is not something I view with fear, and that's a big part of being a death witch. learning not to fear death, as we are often taught to do in Western culture, but rather we allow death to inspire us to live. None of us are promised tomorrow. So have brownies for breakfast and midnight margaritas. Go on that trip. Follow that crazy dream. Make that call. Enjoy the simple pleasures in life. While I wholeheartedly believe in reincarnation, you still only live this life once. You only get to experience this moment as this you once. So make the most of it. If you've read the book, The In-Between by Hadley, and I know I'm going to pronounce her last name improperly, so I do apologize. I believe it is Valos. She is a hospice nurse, and she talks about a patient who had gone through much of her life denying herself the pleasures of this corporeal existence. That patient's advice to Hadley was, eat the cake. Honestly, that could be one of the Death Witch's creeds. Eat the cake. Do what makes your heart happy. Enjoy all the big and small moments you can while you are here as this version of you. And if you find yourself in a horrible place in life, a place that it might likely take you some time for you to extract yourself from, remember that just as all things do, this shall pass. But while you are in that unhappy, uncomfortable, miserable place, there are still joys to be found and life to be lived. I recently picked up a newer tarot deck. It's called the Cozy Witch Tarot, and one of my favorite cards in that deck is the Knight of Cups, which has the words, "Romanticize the present moment every chance you get" on it. That's one of the lessons of the Death Witch. Whether you've got the luck of the Irish or everything is coming up Millhouse, there is always something around that can spark joy in your heart if you merely allow it to do so. Maybe it's the shape of a cloud in the sky. Maybe it's the jovial nature of an elderly man and his dog on the bus. Maybe it's a street taco that is an absolute fall apart mess but tastes like bliss. There's always something there to spark joy, even in our darkest moments, whenever we are ready to let that ember into our hearts and nurture it into a flame. Death is not an ending, but rather the closing of one chapter or one cycle and the beginning of the next. It's not an ending, it's a transition. In fact, one of my favorite death cards is from a deck that doesn't call it death at all, but rather the card is titled Transformation. Death witches understand and embrace the impermanence of things. As the Buddha said, all life is transitory. I had figured this out by my teens, and I'm not saying that I never struggle with attachments, but even by my teens, I had learned that even if you cling tightly to something, the only constant in this world is change. My female parental unit is the constant victim in her life, according to her, and so she was always clinging to some perceived slight unfairness or wound in life, and she is like this even today. I bring this up not to cast shade at her. We are each where we are on our own paths, but I bring this up to illustrate something I learned early on and that is very applicable in my Death Witch practice. For context, I should clarify that I was the adult in the household by the time I was in kindergarten. I parented my younger brother and my parents while raising myself. My female parental unit accused me of being cold because, in my teens, when she'd play her broken woe is me record, I would respond with what she considered to be my catchphrase. That phrase was, mourn and move on. We will all experience many deaths and endings in our lives. We can and should grieve for them in healthy ways. But we can't unpack our bags and take up residency in that space. Yes, we absolutely need to take time to feel what we feel and to process those feelings. But ultimately, we have to move on from that place. While I didn't academically know the ins and outs of the grieving process as a teen, I had a handle on the impermanence of things, and viewed it as part of the natural order of life, the universe, and everything. Mourn and move on. While my female parental unit saw this as cold because I wasn't pandering to her attention-seeking behavior, my phrase was not, nor was it meant to be, cold. And it's a phrase I still use for myself to this day, to remind me that it's okay to be sad, or whatever I feel about an ending or a transition or a death in life. And that I need to take time to sit with those feelings, to process them. But ultimately, I need to move on. I need to live. I mentioned earlier that death witches might be drawn to palliative or hospice care. That was never my vocation, though I did go into a helping profession. However, I found myself sort of in that position several times in my life. I don't know how it began, but somehow in my family, I became the person primarily responsible for caring for terminally ill pets and pets that had passed in our family. There are actually many examples of this in my life, but here's one that most notably stands out to me. When I was 18, my female parental unit had an indoor pet black rabbit named Onyx. He became sick with pneumonia, which if you've kept rabbits you know is often a death sentence. I took care of him, giving him his pills, or at the very least assisting my female parental unit with the task. But after a few days, he did pass, and I was the one holding him as he did. I broke the news to my male parental unit, and both of them were beside themselves. I then prepared Onyx's body for burial by cleaning his body off and wrapping him in an old baby blanket I still had in my closet with some of my old baby dolls from childhood. I then helped to dig the hole that we placed him into and said a few words before covering the gravesite. This to say that while I was as sad as everyone else at the loss, I was the one who was able to function around death when others couldn't. And honestly, while there's a lot of shade that I could throw at my family, I don't mean any shade here either. I was just built different. I was always more comfortable around and with death than others. And so whether it was a pet or a person, I was the one in the family who took care of the departed and the living in these times. I'm not special or better than any of them. It was just part of my trauma response, if we're being honest. I was the caretaker of the living and the dead, and while I could choose to see this as a burden, I rather choose to see it as a privilege. I remember when my sister passed. I was 5 years old, and my father took me to Hills with him. For those of you who don't know Hills, it was a store like Kmart or Ames. Think smaller versions of Walmart before Walmart was a thing. I helped him pick out the dress, socks, headband, and baby shoes that we would bury her in. While you may be inclined to criticize my father for this, as many would consider this inappropriate, and I have had people say that to me over the years, you have to remember that I've always just been different about the topic of death. I would not undo that trip even if I were given the opportunity. It allowed me to care for my departed sister. In older times, even in Western culture, the family would prepare the body of their departed loved one for burial. This is still common practice in some parts of the world. While I couldn't prepare her body for burial, as the funeral director did, this act allowed me to participate in that process, and I will forever be grateful for that. Death and I, well, we have an interesting relationship. I wouldn't say we are friends, but we have a tendency to cross paths and are amicable with each other. My sister's passing would not be the only significant one of my childhood. I was thinking about my connection to death and my encounters with it, and while I'm not sure this next story really fits into this podcast episode, I felt compelled to add it to this episode. So I'm going to trust that Spirit has a reason and share it with you. When I was 15, I had a paper route. That first summer, as I delivered papers, there was an elderly gentleman who I'd often encounter sitting on his back porch as I slung newspapers. Instead of tossing his onto his porch because he was sitting there, I'd step off of the alley and walk the paper up to him and hand it to him. He'd strike up a conversation with me, and he'd tell me I was welcome to go into his house and grab a pop out of his fridge. Now, I was a street-smart 15-year-old and had been thoroughly warned of stranger danger. So at first I politely declined. But as I began to find him on his porch each day as I delivered papers, I realized that he was waiting for me, and not in a creepy way, just so that he could chit-chat. One day, his wife came out on the porch, and this was when I found out the elderly gentleman was terminally ill. She brought out a drink for him, and because she had heard my voice, she brought out a can of pop for me, which this time I accepted. In that moment, I understood that my willingness to stand and chat with an old man who was facing his mortality was an important act. We didn't talk about him being ill or that his time was looming. We talked about everything else in life. Eventually, he would reach a point where they had to amputate both of his legs, and he became bedbound. When that happened, I began delivering his papers to him in the hospital bed they had set up for him in what had been their living room. Before he passed, his wife pulled me aside and told me how much it meant to both of them that someone so young would take time out of their day to share a smile and a conversation with an old man. He passed not long after the amputation, and I attended his viewing so that I could say thank you. He taught me so much about how monumental small kindnesses can be, and how much just a few moments of our time can mean to someone. When I was in college, I took a photography class because I had always loved photography, but had never really had a chance to do it. I was a broke-ass college kid, and I can say a lot of things, as we've mentioned, about my parental units, but the only reason I was able to take that class was because my male parental unit allowed me to use his Canon 35mm camera for the class. Yes, I'm old. Digital cameras hadn't caught on yet, and the particular photography class I took was specifically for black and white photography, which is still one of my loves to this day, even though I am all digital now. I still love black and white photography because it just is a whole mood and a whole vibe and a whole art. For me, photography is art, and like most artists, we do tend to have a subject that is our favorite or our preference or our specialty. Mine quickly became photographing cemeteries and graveyards. I have been to so many cemeteries and graveyards in my life, and I will travel to cemeteries like other people travel to national parks or backpack around Europe. This was an integral part of both who I was and my spiritual practice when we lived back in Pennsylvania. After we moved to Washington, I didn't get to do that here for a few different reasons, but it's finally time, and I'm finally starting to visit and make connections with the cemeteries and graveyards here, and I am so very excited for this, and there probably will be some episodes about it. Another thing that has become an essential part of my practice that I don't feel enough people do, let alone talk about, is helping the spirits of the dead who aren't at rest. Some of you know that I got into paranormal investigations in my early 20s, and at that time, no one really talked about helping the spirits that we encounter in these investigations. There was talk about helping the living, but not really the dead. And honestly, up to that point, the only person I had really heard talk about helping the restless dead was Mary Summer Rain, who was taught to do so by No Eyes. But the deeper I got into paranormal investigations, the more it didn't sit right with me. The more I thought we should really be doing more for the restless dead, aka earthbound spirits, in these spaces. And so, since I am a medium, that became a big part of my standard practice for wrapping up any investigations that I had done, or even just something that I do before leaving any haunted space that I have been at, even if I wasn't investigating it. And I've actually gotten some hate for this over the years because paranormal tourism is a thing. And some people get really mad when they learn that I actually give the restless dead a chance to heal and move on if they want to. And some people don't like that because they want the space to remain haunted for entertainment purposes. We have to remember, though, many of these spirits are people too, and they deserve just as much compassion and help as the living do. Just as people aren't there for our amusement, neither are the spirits of people who have passed over. I have a variety of ways that I offer help to the restless dead, but among them are spirit releasement therapy and Reiki. Since my education and work background are in psych, it seemed only fitting for me to offer a sort of therapy for ghosts. How this looks in my personal practice isn't exactly how I was taught to do spirit releasement therapy, but it works. When it comes to Reiki, I am a Usui Reiki master teacher, but I've also studied and trained in several other types of Reiki as well, and one that I find particularly helpful in my work with the restless dead is grief Reiki. Death and I haven't only crossed paths when it comes to the passing of those I've known and loved. I've had a couple very close brushes with death myself. The stories are a bit long, so I'll save them for another time, but the TLDR versions of these 3 closest brushes with death are as follows. When I was pregnant with my first child in 2008, the pregnancy went smoothly enough, but labor and delivery did not. After over 24 hours of labor, the first 18 or so I tried to do as natural childbirth, I had to have an emergency C-section because he was not going to get here the traditional route. As they were getting close to extracting him, I did not feel right. I knew something was amiss. He did not start crying right away, and I was feeling more off by the second. I remember chanting over and over again in my head, "Just let me hear him cry, just let me hear him cry." He did, and at that moment I tried to tell the anesthesiologist by my head that something was not right with me, but I didn't get the chance. Everything went black as I crashed. They were able to revive me with 2 shots of epi, but in the meantime, I was in this dark space. Blacker than a moonless midnight, but there were these pinpricks of light everywhere. I had the sense that this was a waiting area. There were no signs, no furniture, no signals to tell me this. I just had this sense. I wasn't dead yet, but I wasn't entirely alive either. I was just there, waiting, filled with a sense of calm. And then my eyes opened, and my son's father came to my side holding our firstborn. Then there was what was probably my closest brush with death. In 2010, a doctor had diagnosed me with type 2 diabetes. But, spoiler alert, she was wrong. She was treating my diabetes with oral medication, and it was beautifully controlled. But there was a cost. I actually have what is called LADA, which is late onset type 1 diabetes, or some doctors call it diabetes 1.5 because it has features of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. The short story is that in 2013, I hadn't been feeling well for about a week or so, but being the stubborn tourist that I am, I hadn't said anything about it. Then one morning I woke up and was in very severe pain. I can tell you it was, in fact, worse than childbirth. I got my neighbor to take me to the ER, where we discovered that I had extremely severe pancreatitis, and I was promptly whisked away from the local hospital to the ICU in Pittsburgh, where the doctor said I had 0 chance of survival. I spent about a week in the ICU facing death, and it was, a very spiritual experience. I have a tattoo on my foot to commemorate my time, and there's a lot, and yet not a lot, that happened while I was there. The reason that this brush with death happened, that I came so close to crossing through the veil, is because the oral medication they had been giving me for years at that point had killed what little pancreas function I had had to begin with and had necrotized parts of my pancreas. I will tell you this about that time, though. Laying there in that bed, being told that I was certainly going to cross over, was the calmest I have ever felt in my life. And as I sat there, laid there, actually, for being accurate, I was not at all afraid. My third close brush with death was when my kidneys went, you know what? She's already got diabetes and lupus, so instead of waiting, let's just join the party now. I developed primary FSGS, which is a form of chronic and progressive kidney disease, unrelated, separate from the diabetes or the lupus. They were having trouble figuring out which type of kidney disease I had come down with, and while they were trying to figure that out, my body was filling with fluids. As they were trying to decide what I had and how to treat it, I was down to less than 10% of my kidney function, and they had to come in and check on me every 15 minutes to see if my lungs were filling with fluid or if the fluid had begun to fill the sac around my heart. They had prepared me for the potential that I would, in fact, drown on dry land. They told me it was a very real possibility unless they could figure it out in time. But thankfully, they found the right meds, and within a few days, I was able to go home. But it was pretty close. So, yeah, Death and I, we've spent some time in the same circles. We've talked about some heavy stuff, so let's lighten it back up a little bit. While not all death witches are super into divination, it's not uncommon to find death witches for whom divination is a large part of their practice. Hence the name of this podcast. I am one such death witch. But I'm also not just working with the divination tools. I'm also always communicating with spirits when I do readings. Some are guides and the like, and some are spirits of the dead. Every reading I do, whether it's tarot, charm casting, tea leaf reading, oracle cards, whatever, there are spirits at the table with me. If I'm doing divination, I'm doing spirit communication or necromancy. Yeah, I know, I just have a thing with saying it like that and making it very dramatic because it amuses me, I'm sorry. And that's why my shop name is Spirit Tarot, because the core of my practice, even if I don't always make it overt, is that I'm communicating with spirits every day. Death witchcraft isn't simply a label for me or an aesthetic. It permeates my whole life. So if you've ever felt alone in life, one thing I can tell you as a death witch is that we are never truly alone. We've all got spirits around us, from departed loved ones watching over us, to ancestors, to spirit guides. You've got a team ready and willing to support you and aid you on your journey. The other thing I can tell you is that death is not something to fear. I'm not saying we should rush towards it by any means, but we will all make that transition eventually. And while I can't say exactly what you'll see when you cross over, I can tell you that it is nothing to fear. I think, feel, believe that what each of us sees when we cross will be individual to us as we ease into that ultimate reality beyond our current reality. It's not scary or bad or punitive. It's just the next chapter. The closest pop culture reference to what I believe happens when we pass is the Robin Williams movie, What Dreams May Come. Though I will add the caveat that I don't believe suicides go through exactly what we see in the film, based off of my work with spirits, including those who have hit the escape button themselves. There are many other ways that my practices fit into the Death Witch label, but I think that for today, I've droned on enough for this episode anyway. You don't have to call yourself a death witch to engage in many of the practices that we do, and even if you don't resonate with the death witch label, there still will be plenty of content covered in this podcast that you can enjoy and use in your personal practice if you so choose. There are a lot more ways and examples of how I embody and practice death witchcraft, but these are things that I felt called to talk about in today's episode. We'll have many episodes to come where we dive deeper into these practices and topics and all things associated with divination, death witchcraft, paganism, spirituality, the paranormal, all of that stuff. I hope that you've enjoyed our little chat today, and until I see you in the next episode, blessings to you wherever your journey finds you.